We had a activist who worked with us. She took her dog and swam in the lake, and the dog died a few days
Oh,
later.
that didn't turn out well.
Yeah, no, because it affected. So that's the thing. It wasn't just affecting humans, and you can imagine what it did to all the other life in and around the lake.
Welcome back to the Rights of the Lake series as part of Pulse of the Great Lakes. Today, we are moving into the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, also known as LEBOR. We are joined again today by Trish O'Dell and Ben Price from Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, also known as CELDEF. So welcome back, Trish and Ben. I'm happy to have you guys back for this second episode.
Thanks, Tamara. And just to let you know, it's Tish.
Didn't I say Tish?
Trish.
What did I say?
No, and that's okay.
Said Trish.
My family even sometimes says Trish. So
I apologize because Trish is not in my mind for you. I don't know why I said Trish. Pardon me.
I've been called worse things. Trust me, I've been called worse things. So it's okay.
In episode 1, Tish and Ben shared a little bit more about their background. We're not going to go over that again today. So you can go back to episode 1 and listen in to learn more about them. So we're going to dive right into this today, and we're going to talk about the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. And Ben, we are going to start with you. For people who are only vaguely familiar with it or don't remember it or never heard of it at all, such as myself in the beginning, what is the Lake Erie Bill of Rights and what type of reaction did it get, if any, on the national level?
Well, thanks, Tamara. And the Lake Erie Bill of Rights really was quite a phenomenon. It was enacted by the people of Toledo. And Tish will go through kind of the story of how that all unfolded. But it actually became law in the city of Toledo as a charter amendment. The city charter, it's like a local constitution. So on February 26th of 2019, the people voted on a ballot question on whether or not to add this piece of legislation to their charter. And they overwhelmingly approved it. Over 60% of the voters approved it. I think because people aren't familiar with what it is, I mean, they may have even heard of it. There was a lot of coverage, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But because people may not be aware of just how significant a piece of legislation this was, I'd like to actually take a look at the language itself. I won't read the whole thing. It's not even that long. It's a couple of pages, really. But I'd like to just give folks a chance to hear what this bill actually said, rather than try to describe it. So let me get started on that. And again, I'm not going to read the whole thing. There's kind of a preamble section, and I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs from that. And so let me begin. We, the people of the city of Toledo, find that laws ostensibly enacted to protect us and to foster our health, prosperity, and fundamental rights to do neither, and that the very air, land, and water on which our lives and happiness depend are threatened. Thus, it has become necessary that we reclaim, reaffirm, and assert our inherent and inalienable rights, and to extend legal rights to our natural environment in order to ensure that the natural world, along with our values, our interests, and our rights are no longer subordinated to the accumulation of surplus wealth and unaccountable political power. That I find to be pretty clear about what the people of Toledo were saying here. And what's significant about this law is that it was the first law in the country to recognize legally enforceable rights for a specific ecosystem. And so I'll read a little bit more about this bill, what it says in the preamble. It closes the preamble with these words: and since all power of governance is inherent in the people, and by the way, that comes from Article 1, Section 2 of the Ohio State Constitution. Since all power of governance is inherent in the people, We, the people of the city of Toledo, declare and enact this Lake Erie Bill of Rights, which establishes irrevocable rights for the Lake Erie ecosystem to exist, flourish, and naturally evolve, a right to a healthy environment for the residents of Toledo, and which elevates the rights of the community and its natural environment over powers claimed by certain corporations. That's very significant language about overcoming the power of corporations in this law. There's a section that enumerates the Community Bill of Rights, as Section 1 is called. And the first of those rights is the rights of Lake Erie ecosystem, which again says Lake Erie and the Lake Erie watershed possess the right to exist, flourish, and naturally evolve. The Lake Erie ecosystem shall include all natural water features, communities of organisms, soil, as well as terrestrial and aquatic sub-ecosystems that are part of Lake Erie and its watershed. The second right that's listed is the right to a clean and healthy environment, and it asserts that, quote, the people of the city of Toledo possess the right to a clean and healthy environment, which shall include the right to a clean and healthy Lake Erie and Lake Erie ecosystem. And the third right enumerated is the right of local community self-government. And it declares that the people of the city of Toledo possess both a collective and individual right to self-government in their local community, a right to a system of government that embodies that right, and the right to a system of government that protects and secures their human, civil, and collective rights. And so that is the rights language that is in the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. And there's more. I'm not going to go through much more of it here, but just to say a couple of really significant sections, one under enforcement, general enforcement for the bill, Section D under that section, which is the third in the bill. It says the Lake Erie ecosystem may enforce its rights and this law's prohibitions through an action prosecuted either by the city of Toledo or a resident or residents of the city in Lucas County Court of Common Pleas, General Division. Such court action shall be brought in the name of the Lake Erie ecosystem as the real party in interest. Damages shall be measured by the cost of restoring the Lake Erie ecosystem and its constituent parts, at least to their status immediately before the commencement of the acts resulting in injury, and shall be paid to the city of Toledo to be used exclusively for the full and complete restoration of the Lake Erie ecosystem and its constituent parts. And that's to the original status. And finally, under enforcement of corporate powers, the bill says this: corporations that violate this law or that seek to violate this law shall not be deemed to be, quote, persons, to the extent that such treatment would interfere with the rights or prohibitions enumerated by this law, nor shall they possess any other legal rights, powers, privileges, immunities, or duties that would interfere with the rights or prohibitions enumerated by this law, including the power to assert state or federal preemptive laws in an attempt to overturn this law, or the power to assert that the people of the city of Toledo lack the authority to adopt this law. And that last piece is very significant, as we'll find out. So that's the general language. There's more to it. It's not a lot of language that I haven't read that really affects what this thing looks like and what it would do. But you had asked, okay, so what was the impact of this thing? You know, what kind of an effect?
It doesn't seem on the surface, it doesn't seem controversial. The language on the surface level, it doesn't. When you read through it, it makes common logical sense.
You mean to people, to humans?
To people, yes. To humans, yes.
Well,
not corporations.
As it turns out, it didn't make any sense to agribusiness corporations and the Chamber of Commerce and the Farm Bureau and folks like that who opposed it. But It got a lot of attention. Okay, it was the first law in the United States, and it was enacted, and it was law, went into effect in Toledo, became part of their local constitution, their city charter. And people took notice, and the media took notice. So, there were articles when it came out that were published by the Smithsonian Magazine, by NPR. There was broadcast coverage, print coverage in Mother Jones, in the New York Times, in Grist, The Daily Show, which some people get their news from. It's comedy, but it's also
a lot of people get their news from.
it's comedic treatment of real news, which is probably I don't know, maybe more objective than some of the so-called objective news that we see. So the Daily Show did a spot on it, a piece of the show that covered it in a kind of a humorous way. So Lake Erie now has rights as a person. No, we can get into all of that. But what else? Well, Democracy Now! Covered it as a news item. The Ohio State Law Journal published an article about it that's pretty significant. And this was kind of after things kind of shook out in the legal system around it. The article that the Ohio State Law Journal published was titled Lake Erie Bill of Rights, Stifled by All Three Branches. That's all three branches of government, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. So it's Lake Erie Bill of Rights, stifled by all three branches, yet still significant. And I think it's important for us to notice that it was an important piece of legislation when it was enacted, and it remains an important piece of legislation, even though it has been attacked by the corporate world and stifled, as that article's title says. The State Bar Association of Michigan published an article about it immediately. A Harvard Law Review also covered it. So it didn't go without notice. And I think there was some international coverage as well.
That's what I was just going to add, Ben. It wasn't just national, it was international. I mean, we had people contacting us from France. Le Monde did an article, Italy, Canada, Germany, The Spiegel, India. There was an article. So, yeah, Australia. I mean, yeah, this is why it was so, I think, frightening to the powers that be.
Yeah, it literally was international, not just a local.
That's for sure.
All right, Tish, why don't you segue into telling us the story of LEBOR, like what conditions were in place to actually start this? Now that we know what it is, what came about to make this legislation happen?
Yeah, it's, and I never get tired of telling the story because it's a great story. And it goes back, even though the bill passed in 2019, the story starts back in 2014, because it was August of 2014 in the summer that residents woke up to all these warnings. I mean, across the TV, the computer, radio, everywhere, and saying, do not drink the water. But also it went beyond that. It was don't touch the water, don't shower in the water, don't do your dishes, don't do laundry, that it could make you sick. It's not like sometimes I know we've all experienced those like boil alerts, where maybe they're cleaning out the pipes or something. This was different. Right. There, you couldn't boil this. It was just don't touch the water, let alone drink it. And of course, what happened, bottled water flew off the shelves. I mean, people who had transportation were lucky enough. They drove over 100 miles to get water. FEMA was sent in. I mean, some people didn't have that luxury of a vehicle and being able to haul like water back. It was a really serious situation. And, businesses shut down. The hospital even shut down except for the most serious emergency because you can't function. Restaurants can't function without water to use. So, and this lasted for over 3 days in the hottest time of the year in August. And what had happened, toxic algae had gotten into the water intake. And this wasn't what people sometimes are surprised by. This wasn't the first algae problem, and it wasn't even the largest. I think it was 2013, the algae bloom was even bigger than it was in 2014. But the issue was that it got into the water intake. And some people think, well, it's just algae, but it's very dangerous. It's toxic. There's cyanobacteria, microcystin is part of this, and it causes all kinds of problems. I mean, they're doing studies on it now. It could be add to ALS or Parkinson's. I mean, yeah, they're just finding out how harmful this is. So it was serious. I know we had a activist who worked with us. She took her dog and swam in the lake, and the dog died a few days later.
That didn't turn out well.
Yeah, no, because it affected. So that's the thing. It wasn't just affecting humans, and you can imagine what it did to all the other life in and around the lake. But so what happened is, of course, the city, they add more chemicals to the water and say, this will solve the problem, and tried to blow it under the rug, so to speak. But the people then from 2014 to 2018, they tried to work within the system, like something we would all do. So they were angry, of course, and they did what we're taught to do for the next 3 years. They went to their electeds. They did research on what was causing the algae. And the state, it turns out, had spent tons of money already addressing the algae problem, monitoring it, testing it. So they knew where it was coming from. They tried to get more regulations introduced, have more testing and monitoring of the water. What came out is they said, well, you're going to need a new water treatment plant. And so, of course, the residents were going to have to pay for that. And even people blamed nature itself, right, for this problem, because they were like, well, it was the wind. It was windy, and the wind blew the algae into the water intake. I mean, we heard it all. The people of Toledo heard it all, right? But anyway, we all knew it was coming from the huge corporate industrial agriculture system that operates within Northwest Ohio. I mean, it's huge up there. I mean, and these aren't, small, like they're not growing food that we eat. These are huge farms that are growing crops like soybeans and corn for industrial uses, for plastic and ethanol, and then huge animal factories, so we can have cheap meat. And so they spray all these crops with pesticides and herbicides that have things in it that add to the load of phosphorus and nitrogen in the water, because, of course, it goes off to the fields. And the same thing with the manure from the big animal feeding operations gets spread on the fields, all travels through streams and rivers to the lake. So we didn't need to actually do more research, right? But at the same time, they're giving money for more testing. Yeah, they're also issuing more permits for more of this to continue happening. So, yeah.
So it's a money grab in a sense.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, Tamara.
It's a money grab in a sense.
Yeah. And like Ben talked about in the bill, it's the rights of those corporate entities, right, are so important to make profit. But, I think of it as kind of like fate or the universe coming together, because at this time, CELDF, we were doing a university tour across Ohio around rights of nature. And so some folks from Toledo attended the presentation at Bowling Green University, which isn't very far from Toledo. And so, because they were frustrated now after 3 years trying to work through the system and nothing was changing. And they knew that, were we going to get this warning again someday? Because this keeps happening. Nobody's stopping it. So after the presentation, they came up to us and asked us if we thought rights of nature could work to protect Lake Erie. And they told us this whole story. And so, we went out afterwards to a pub. We discussed it at length, and the first draft of LEBOR was actually written on a bar napkin. I wish I still had that napkin.
I love it.
I know. Yeah.
No kidding.
Yep. So the group really embraced the idea, and so in the concept, and, we all left that night, and I'm like, call me, if you want to pursue this. And I honestly didn't think I'd hear from them, but we did. And then that led to this effort between CELDF and the group in Toledo of drafting the language that Ben wrote. They circulated petitions, got the signatures. In Ohio, we have that right to put initiatives and laws on the ballot in that form. And then the battle started already, even getting it on the ballot. There was attempts to keep it off the ballot. And, we had to go to court, fight for that. But it did finally get on a special election ballot in February of 2019. And even then, the opposition, we found this out afterwards. That's another part of the story maybe for another time, but we found out after the fact that the opposition spent huge sums of money on the campaign to get people to vote against their own best interest. And I think the reason they didn't, obviously, why it was so successful in Toledo, because other communities had tried them, Youngstown and other places in other states, but they failed, even though when they got on the ballot. And I think it's because they tried to scare them with things like Toledo's going to be a ghost town, and like all the businesses will shut down if you pass this law. But they already knew. They knew that the town shut down when you didn't have water. So the people weren't fooled by that ploy.
Absolutely. Okay, Ben, since we know that the legislation actually was passed and went into effect, what happened to strike it down? And how long did it last also? How long was the legislation in effect before it was struck down?
Well, that's an interesting, the answer to that question is interesting to me. I just noticed it, when I was looking at the dates. So the Lake Erie Bill of Rights was enacted by the people of Toledo on February 26, 2019. And the court decided to strike the law, to remove it from the charter that the people had included it in their charter on February 27th, 2020. 1 year,
almost a year to the day.
For a year and a day, Lake Erie had rights for a year and a day.
Can I just interject something quick? I realize I forgot part of the story there, because it leads into this, Ben, for you. But after the bill passed, I was there for the election night and all that, and I was in my hotel room sleeping, got woken up by the phone ringing, and it was a reporter, and he was asking, "What do you think about the lawsuit that was filed?" And I was like, "What lawsuit?" Went to bed all happy, that this passed. And so within 12 hours of it passing, a corporate agricultural entity that wasn't even in Toledo, the jurisdiction of Toledo, filed a major lawsuit to have the Lake Erie Bill of Rights overturned in federal court. And that was the Dravis Farms lawsuit. So anyway, that kind of that when you say what happened immediately after the bill passed, that's what happened immediately after the bill.
Immediately.
Literally.
They did not
within
wait.
12 hours.
And then we had another year of this whole legal stuff in the lawsuit, which is also a really interesting story. So sorry, Ben, go ahead. You can pick that up.
No, that's right. And
that's an important part.
When I think about it, so within 12 hours of over 60% of the voting people in Toledo saying, yes, we want this to be part of our city's charter, a corporation that doesn't even do business within the city sued. And it's an agribusiness corporation that sued. And so to the point of, so how did the court come to a decision on what happens here? Did the court actually go through the law and find, oh, well, of course people have a right not to be poisoned. Of course people have a right to pass a law that says that they have a right not to be poisoned. And of course they have a right to protect their own community and the local environment. I mean, if I'm the judge, I probably wouldn't be one because of this, but I would say, well, that makes sense, just as you did. Well, that makes common sense. People who would be against that? Well, not only was the corporation that sued against it, but so is our whole legal system. And just as the Ohio State Law Journal article said, all three branches of government said that it was illegal, wrong, and should not be upheld. That the decision of over 60% of Toledoans should be overturned, because democracy must be subordinated to what? And the answer is this. The court struck on two major, it went through a lot of language to tell us why the folks in Toledo couldn't have this law, but it was struck on, the first count was that the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution that was enacted after the Civil War to protect the rights of freed slaves to say that they have equal protection of the law and they have due process of the law, the same as white people, the same as people who had never been enslaved or claimed to be property of another human being. So the 14th Amendment's due process clause is what the court said was violated. Wait a minute, the due process of what? Turns out that's the due process of the corporate person, because corporations, based on the federal court system, the Supreme Court, decided that due process under the 14th Amendment is a right that's shared by corporate persons, not just human persons. So on that grounds, the law was struck. And on the other ground that the court noted, that the city of Toledo, as a municipal subdivision of the state of Ohio, overreached its municipal authority in enacting a law that recognized rights that the state did not. So essentially, what the people wrote and what I read in the language of the bill, that rights that are claimed to belong to corporate property can't be used to overturn this law. I'm paraphrasing here, but that the rights of the people to local self-government, to protect their community and their water and the ecosystem that their lives depend on, supersede and is superior to any claimed rights for corporate property. And the federal judiciary said, wrong, corporate rights supersede democratic rights of the people of Toledo. I mean, they didn't say it that way. That's my interpretation of it. But essentially, that is the outcome.
And they give the claim of the 14th Amendment for that. So where in the 14th Amendment does corporate personhood usurp actual personhood? It's supposed to be equal protection, right?
Language.
So if they're poisoning the water that everyone needs to survive, how are they allowed to usurp that?
Well, it's a longer story, maybe for another time for us to talk about the details of it. But beginning back in 1886, the Supreme Court recognized corporate property to be a legal person in the eyes of, specifically in the eyes of the 14th Amendment. This amendment that they pointed to in the LEBOR case. So, and beyond that also, and it was about due process, that you can't deprive a corporation any more than you can deprive a person of the right to go to court and defend their rights. And essentially, the court's saying, by you recognizing rights for the lake and recognizing that the city and the people of the city can enforce those rights against polluters, the court was saying, well, you're not giving the polluters a chance to defend themselves. You're just saying that they don't have a right to do this, to poison the city or the environment. And you can't do that because maybe they do have that right. Well, in fact, they do have that right, because permits are issued to legalize the poisoning of our environment, not just Lake Erie, but the whole planet. And so the law is opposed to environmental protection, essentially, if it is to protect human beings.
Yeah, I want to add something there, if I can, to just boost some of the story here. What you have to understand too, now the people passed this law, right? And not elected officials. It's not like a legislature or the city council, right? These are the people passed this. But the lawsuit was Dravis Farms suing the municipality of Toledo. So what we did, the people who actually drafted the law wanted to become part of the lawsuit, and we would have represented them, because these electeds were not in favor of the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. They actually spoke out, several of them, against it during the campaign. But now they're the ones that are going to defend it, right, in court. So we tried to intervene. It's called, we filed a motion to intervene to try and get into the case. And the judge denied us getting into the case, and the people of Toledo, I should say, getting into the case. At the same time, the state of Ohio filed a motion to intervene in the lawsuit, but on the side of the polluter, on the side of Dravis Farms. And the judge allowed the state of Ohio to intervene.
Wow.
So, I mean, you get right, when we're not exaggerating when we say, that the whole system is against the people and against nature. Yeah.
At every level.
At every level. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting, in that courtroom, listening to some of the things they said, and if you think about it logically, like a lot of the stuff you said, Tamara, about common sense, and you're listening to some of this, so nobody tried to even use the law against a corporation or Dravis Farm. So they're filing this lawsuit proactively, right? But it could harm us if someone tried to use it. Now, normally we couldn't get away with that in a courtroom. A judge would just throw that out, right? It's not ripe for, adjudication.
No harm has been done.
Exactly. You haven't been. But so they were so worried about the words. And so if you think about that, so it's like we're saying, though, the words are saying that, you are not allowed to put these toxins in to harm people. And that shouldn't scare you if you're following practices that don't do that harm. So in other words, they know they're poisoning the lake and the people and the life. And so that's why it's so scary. I mean, if you weren't doing any harm, why would you be scared by the law, right?
Right.
So that to me was an admission right there that, you're harming the lake and the people.
Since the law was invalidated, the LEBOR law was invalidated, and we're learning that our entire judicial system, our entire system, opposes environmental protections, imposes protections against we human beings. What do you think has permanently changed legally, culturally, or strategically with this, since it's not a law that is in practice today?
Well, to me, the law is still so important because of how much it revealed about the legal system and the regulatory system, our government and democracy, right? Like CELDEF, been longer than me, right? We've been going around telling people all this, but a lot of times they don't believe us, right? Like we can point out like how the system's going to work, but they need a real life example. And this was...
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because it sounds ridiculous. It sounds ridiculous. What you just told me is absolutely ridiculous and shouldn't be, but that is the reality of our situation. So somebody who isn't up on all of this or hasn't heard about this or read on this, they would think, oh my gosh, no, that's absolutely ridiculous. Mm-hmm. That can't be true. I get that.
Yeah.
I absolutely get that.
No, that's okay. No, that was one of the, big, I think, revelations of this and why this case is still so important. I mean, we still have, Ben, you just forwarded yesterday to me, like another article that's been written about it. I mean, academics are still writing about it, but it makes it real because this is a real world example. It's not just something that, it could be, or this is how it might be. And this was the first case ever that was tried. Rights of nature and Lake Erie, an ecosystem, was argued in a federal court. And I was lucky. I feel lucky that I was there. It went on for almost an hour, the back and forth arguments. And what was really interesting about listening to the arguments in that courtroom is like how contradictory they were. And you're going to love these, Tamara, because you like this common sense stuff, right? So on one hand, the state would get up their attorneys and their corporate attorneys, and part of their arguments would be, this is just aspirational language. It's like poetry, it's aspirational. Then our attorney, or the city attorney would make some argument, trying to challenge this stuff and that it is real. Then the next thing, they'd get up, the corporate attorneys again, and they'd argue how dangerous LEBOR was, how harmful it was going to be for the agricultural industry and all that. And so I was like, you're sitting there, you're like back and forth, like at a ping pong. It's like, well, which is it? Is it just aspirational poetry, or is it harmful language that can actually have some teeth in it to actually make change, right?
Do not poison us. That is poetry. Jeez.
Yeah. And unfortunately, the judge in that case was very weak. I mean, he was weak, and he'll be clearly forever known as the judge in my mind who was on the wrong side of history. And that's my opinion. I mean, he could have taken the other stance. He could have been brave, and he could have ruled in favor of the law, but I guess that's going to be left for another judge that we don't even know the name of yet. So I guess I'm making a pitch for one of them to be brave.
I think that there was a sense, and I mean, the amount of legal attention, the number of articles that have been published about LEBOR in law journals and for attorneys, and even if they weren't published in law journals, just internal memos about it in law firms and in bar associations and the rest. It really grabbed their attention. If it didn't grab the attention of the public as much as it might have, it sure did matter to the people who are practicing the law, because this would have changed quite a bit. When you think about it, the responsibility of industry not to harm the living system that sustains human life and all other life. I mean, why should that be controversial? Well, for one thing, it could potentially interfere with profit making in a very serious way. Now, if profit can be made off of harming people and harming the planet, is that profit something that we should allow? We don't allow a lot of things. We don't allow murder. We don't say, well, we're going to regulate it, or we're going to, well, there's money involved in assassination. We'll allow that too. We'll just regulate it. No, you don't regulate things that do absolute harm and violate rights. This was a law that would have corrected that. In some senses, it would have emancipated Lake Erie the way that abolitionists wanted to emancipate people from slavery prior to the Civil War. We treat the world as though as property, as enslaved property that can be used in whatever manner its owner desires, even to the point of destruction and death.
Of all of us.
Now, that's something we should be paying attention to. And at the local level and nationally and internationally, we should be campaigning very hard to change that.
So what has happened since then? So that it was overturned a year later in 2020. Has there been a fight since then on LEBOR? Has it gone to court again? Has it been modified in any way?
Well, there's two things to bring up here. One is, I think I mentioned about the money. They found out afterwards about the money spent on the campaign. The campaign was so lopsided, right? I mean, I didn't give that amount. It was we discovered over $300,000 on this it's a local. I mean, Toledo's not very big. I mean, it's a city, but it's not a huge city. And we found out that it came from BP. And Dick Cheney's daughter in Virginia has a consultant. That's how the money was funneled through. And it's interesting because there's a big BP refinery actually very close in Toledo, or it's like a little bit on the outskirts. So if you think about that, right, they're very concerned, right, because they're putting pollutants into the air, which we know can go over into the water. They may also be depositing into the water, the mommy, which goes into Lake Erie. So I'm sure they had some concerns about the law. The other thing,
because the air would be next.
Yeah, and the community group spent only like $5,500. That's all. So it was like $5,500 versus over $300,000. But what we also found out after the fact, and when you're asking what happened after, so it's like this great, all these things that it should actually be made into, one of these dramatic movies probably. But we found emails through public records requests because there was something inserted into the Ohio budget bill. This was in May of 2019. So right after it passed in February. And there was language inserted to preempt at the state level into the budget bill any more rights of nature attempts.
Really?
Yeah. So it basically was language that, no other community, or you can't recognize the rights of nature, and no court, you can't enter court, doesn't give you, you can't have standing for an ecosystem, all this stuff. But what we found out in the public records requests is that it was the Ohio Chamber of Commerce that drafted the language and handed it off to a legislator to insert into this several thousand-page budget bill the night before the vote was taken.
Gosh, I hate that.
So
I can't say on this podcast what I want to say with how angry that makes me. That is obscene. So is it in their legislation then to this day?
Oh, well, yeah, because most of the legislators didn't even know it was in there. And think about it. I mean, one, we're supposed to have single issue laws and bills, right? And we're supposed to be able to go have debate and discussions about what's in them. So, I mean, it's so insidious and it's awful the way, yeah, this is all done and so underhanded and corrupt. I mean, it's like, yeah, just hand it off to a legislator. And we found it all through public records requests. So, it was another activist who's working on community rights in Ohio.
That
Yeah,
is so
I mean,
frustrating. That makes me angry.
that's
This
how
is why it's
that's
so
how
important to
dangerous.
know who the hell you're voting for and to not just listen to rhetoric, but to actually investigate people that you want to vote for, where they're getting their money, who they're getting it from, what they support. And people need to read bills. And, and I get it because these bills are so long sometimes. And when you have pork barrel stuff like that in there and you throw it into the back of something that's important, which should not be allowed, and things like this get passed, and then it's a precedent, right? And then the fight becomes that much more difficult after that.
Right. But the fact being though, again, that it did, and it shows just how threatened they felt by this law. So I told the people, I
Of
said, actually, the
course.
fact that happened, I mean, that means you're really attacking on the right level, right? Because if you weren't, they wouldn't
Yeah,
care that much.
that's for sure. So you all know that I'm really big on wanting to have rights of nature legislation throughout the Great Lakes Basin region because these 5 lakes are so critical to so many things and our ecosystems, our way of life, our lives at that. So what lessons should other cities or even states take from Toledo and LEBOR before trying something similar? And there's another question that just popped up. Since Ohio did this, where they backhandedly passed legislation that to preempt additional rights of nature legislation, do you know of any other states in the Great Lakes Basin region who have done the same or are thinking about doing the same?
There, there are a few. Yeah, I'm trying to think where it has been.
Florida's preempted it. It's no, Wyoming, I believe. I think it's Wyoming. I think
Right,
preempted it, and Utah, I believe.
and I think Wisconsin has a bill pending
That
to
doesn't
do that.
surprise me.
So yeah, it's not all Great Lakes states, but so it's a handful of them. So one of the things that we are pursuing, and by stroke of luck in some ways, we were approached by a legislator in New York State who wanted to apply the Lake Erie Bill of Rights as a state law, and that's a whole other story. But and we're also and we've done that. It's been introduced. It's been amended and reintroduced. It's not got any legs at this point yet, but I think if really longer term, what would be really wonderful is if at the state level, language like what's in LEBOR applied to the Great Lakes Basin, all of the lakes and the watersheds, could be adopted by the states surrounding the Great Lakes and even Canadian provinces that are adjoining and part of the Great Lakes Basin. I mean, this is a treasure of fresh water on the surface of planet Earth that you can't find elsewhere. And it's very unique, but it's also uniquely endangered. And that impacts not just people, but a whole lot. Millions and millions of people depend on that fresh water. Uh, Not to mention the whole basin in the ecosystems, the watersheds of those inland seas, really. And so we have a responsibility, all of us, since human beings are the ones who are doing the harm. We have a responsibility to do whatever it takes to change that outcome, the outcome that we're living with right now. And we're being told that we're not allowed to, that that's illegal. It's illegal to protect ourselves. It's illegal to protect nature because profit for corporate investors is more important. There's a real conflict there. I mean, if there's a culture war going on, I think we can find it there. And it's between, humans and living systems, and really cold systems that extract what they call resources. They take a living planet and turn it into dead commodities. And we're supposed to support that as the human project and the most important one. And there's a problem with that, I think.
I agree with you 100%. There's a problem with that. We're going to talk about the New York bill. Next podcast, episode 3, is going to be about the New York Rights of Nature bill. So we'll get into that much more deeply in that next one. But is there anything else that you want to say about that in this one, with regard to LEBOR? Tish, is there anything else that you would want to add?
Well, what's interesting is, again, it's Representative Burke in New York who introduced it. And I actually had a conversation with him. He contacted us, and it was after the Lake Erie Bill of Rights was, struck down by the federal court. And he's like, can you help me draft a Great Lakes Bill of Rights? And I'm like, well, you do know that the Lake Erie Bill of Rights was overturned, right? And he's like, yeah, I know that. And he's like, but that's why we need to keep pursuing this. And he's like, and I've thought about it more, and it's like, one lake isn't enough.
I like his attitude.
Yeah, he's like, one lake isn't enough. They're all interconnected, and so it doesn't make sense. So It was really refreshing to at least have that single individual. We don't have that happen ever. I don't think it's ever happened. But he's been willing to reintroduce it. It has, like Ben said, been amended. And it's also, there's been a couple of other, that was the first state legislator to introduce rights of nature into a bill into the legislature. But there's been a couple since then. So North Carolina also has introduced one. I believe Minnesota or Wisconsin. Now I always get them confused. One of the two. I think it was Minnesota. So and then there's talk of other places. Washington State right now. Ben's actually working with a group in Michigan. There's been talk of people in New Jersey that they're kind of shopping around for legislators to see if they can find another legislator like Burke. New York.
There might be a couple that I know in Michigan. There might be one or two that I know in Michigan. We'll talk about it.
What it does is it at least like starts the conversation, right? At least gives you something to point to and say, this is the language we have. This is how it would look, how it could work. We also, after LEBOR got overturned, a group contacted us in Cincinnati, Ohio, and said, we want to draft something to protect the Ohio River. So we worked with them, and same thing. I said to them, well, there's a preemption law in Ohio now against rights of nature. And they're like, yeah, we know that, but we still want to pursue this. And then also a group in Columbus is working on preemption. They're actually right now circulating a petition to put in their city charter that the state can't preempt, or the federal government preempt, laws passed by the local governments.
Oh, I love that.
That protect, right, that are in the best interests of people and nature and all those things. So protect their rights to a healthy environment. So, there's a lot that's still happening. It's not exactly like the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, but there's groups that have, built upon this, and they're trying to push it in different ways forward. And it's interesting, as much as they tried, right, that was the big fear of the status quo, that the genie got out of the bottle, right? The idea of rights of nature and what it means and what it could mean. And they can't put it back in. So I'm really thrilled about that.
Yeah, and I think where we are in 2026 and everything that's happening, and now we have data centers that are coming onto it, I think people are becoming more and more aware. You're not considered a tree hugger or, whatever term they used to call people back in the day that cared about the environment. More and more people are realizing how important this type of legislation is and how at risk we truly are. More and more people are becoming aware of that every day, I think, especially in this region. We take these lakes for granted so much. And people are starting to realize, because you can't go swimming, you can't let your dogs run in it. Like, I have to drive where I'm at. I'm in the Saginaw Bay of Lake Huron, and I have to drive 2.5 to 3 hours north to let my dog go in the water and play in the water, because of all of the algae blooms around in the Saginaw Bay as well, for the agricultural runoff. So we in this region, we specifically know what it is, but if you look at the satellite images of Lake Erie, where Toledo is, if you look at the Saginaw Bay area, you see from satellite photos the pollution in our Great Lakes. And then in the past 5-7 years, they've started to show up in Lake Superior as well. So I think people are becoming more and more aware of it. So I think now, honestly, pushing this legislation now is such the perfect time for this, because we're going to get more support from the general public. And that is power in numbers, right? At least that's my belief. Power in numbers and getting the right legislators in state office to support the people versus corporate personhood. My 2 cents on that.
What's really interesting too, another thing I hadn't even thought till we were just talking, and it's like goes back to the first podcast when we were talking about rights of nature and what it does. And that's another, I think, legacy of the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, because it got so much media attention. It's so different, right, from all the other environmental protection laws. And it's trying to get people to think outside of single issues, right? So this bill doesn't specify like it's stopping fracking or it's stopping data centers or any of these, or big ag, right? It's like the whole ecosystem. So it's any poisons or toxins. And we're so used to having to fight everything on that single issue basis. So trying to break down some of these silos. And again, like me and Ben both mentioned in the first one, I mean, that idea that we humans are only part of the ecosystem, you know, so trying to make those like cultural shifts and ways of thinking that stop just focusing on the single issues. I mean, yes, they're all problems, but they all impact the ecosystem, and we also are impacted by all that. So if you could have the healthy ecosystem, we'd all be protected.
We're all healthy. When it's healthy, we are healthy. So I'm going to end with this question. If Lake Erie could speak, what do you think it would say regarding the legal battle around our relationship with water and ourselves as far as rights of nature legislation?
I don't want to speak for the lake, but if I was the lake, I think I'd say, get over yourselves, humans. You're not all you're cracked up to be, you know. You haven't been around as long as we have, and you won't be around as long afterwards either. So you may as well enjoy your life while you're here. Drink some clean water instead of this stuff that you're creating. I mean, it's just silly.
When I think it's because, again, and that's something I learned, you know, from reading indigenous, you know, works and books and talking to indigenous people. And it, like, you know, we're so in our culture, we call nature it, right? We objectify it. It's an object. And it's a lot easier to harm and kill it, right, when it's an it than when you say she. But I think the lake would say thank you to all those attempting to emancipate her and to force, you know, humans and our human created system, I guess, to see her. And I think she would say, don't give up, because you're really just killing yourselves and your loved ones. Back to that idea, I think she would say, remember, what you do to me, you do to yourselves.
Thank you both. We will see you on next episode.
Thanks, Tamara.
Thanks, Tamara.